First of all, Annie, can you just explain what you did as an intelligence officer without going into too much detail, obviously? How did you start off in the intelligence services?
I sort of fell into it by accident. I wanted to be a diplomat and applied to the Foreign Office, and then had a very mysterious letter from the Ministry of Defence saying there may be other jobs I'd find more interesting. And I took it from there, and 10 months later I started working. This was in January 1991, and I was there to the end of 1996. And I was employed as a general duties intelligence officer, which means that you effectively run the operations. You're given a target, and then you have a range of specialist techniques to investigate that target. Then you get the information back from these techniques, which you then assess and then decide what actions to take.
But you became quite quickly quite disillusioned by it, I think, and you decided to leave the service in very controversial circumstances.
Very much so, yes. I was there in 3 different postings: political subversion, Irish terrorism and international terrorism, as was my former partner, David Shayler. And in each section we saw things going very badly wrong, which included things like files on government ministers, IRA bombs that could and should have been prevented, innocent people going to prison, even though MI5 knew they were innocent, on terrorist charges, illegal telephone taps, and it culminated with an illegal operation to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi of Libya in 1996, which was backed and funded by MI6. And they were actually funding a group of al-Qaeda extremists in Libya at the very time that MI5 was beginning to investigate them. And it was also illegal under UK law. So we couldn't think of anything more heinous, and that's why we decided to resign and then go public and blow the whistle to try and ensure there would be an inquiry and that the intelligence agencies would be reformed.
And what was the result of your going public?
Well, it was very interesting because, of course, they immediately injuncted the story. We ended up having to go on the run around Europe, literally. And David Shayler went to prison not once but twice. First of all, when they failed to extradite him from France in 1998. And then, secondly, after he returned voluntarily to stand trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act. And he was sentenced to do 6 months at the end of 2002. So it was a very heavy price to pay, but not just for ourselves. It's not just about loss of career, loss of professional prospects, loss of liberty in some cases. It's also about what happens to your friends and family, because I was arrested. I was never charged or anything. His brother, his 2 best friends were arrested. Student activists and campaigners were arrested on trumped-up charges. And a number of journalists were threatened with prosecution, and one indeed was convicted, all for trying to expose the crimes of the spies. And of course, they got away with it. They literally got away with murder in this case. And there was never any proper inquiry. And from what I can gather, in the last decade, the same sort of malpractice has gone on, but it's intensified and got worse. And that's partly, I think, because of the extreme secrecy within which they work. They are the least accountable, most legally protected of all intelligence all intelligence communities in the Western world. So they can get away with whatever they want. And we're seeing this even to this day, post-Snowden disclosures, where we had this so-called historic grilling of the 3 top spies in front of the Parliamentary Committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee. And everyone was saying, oh, this is great. Look, they're being transparent and open. Well, one, they weren't given a grilling. They barely touched on Snowden. They wouldn't answer anything they didn't want to by claiming national security interests. And then it emerged a couple of days later, of course, that they had only agreed to appear if they were told the questions in advance. So it was just a sham hearing. There was no accountability, no real oversight, and there will be no reform.
Do you think that since your day there has been any substantive change? Because, you left quite a while ago, but do you think there's been any substantive change in perhaps the operations of MI6 and the level of oversight over them? There
has indeed been a level of substantive change, no doubt about it. In the 90s, it was a sort of marginally golden ethical era of their 100 years' existence, because they had been put on a legal footing for the first time in the late 1980s, and it was pre-9/11 when the intelligence gloves came off. So I think what has happened since 9/11, particularly with the UK and the US intelligence agencies, is that they are much more brutal in their response to these perceived threats. They have been caught up in scandal after scandal with taking our countries into an illegal war in Iraq on fake intelligence, where they're involved in kidnapping terrorist suspects, taking them to black prisons and torturing them, and where they also now have a CIA kill list, which is signed off by the President of the United States every week on a Tuesday, with a list of terrorist suspects, no process, no evidence, no nothing. And they can then be assassinated anywhere on the planet using drone strikes, and they're doing this regularly.
And sticking to the British security services, do you think they're complicit in this? They would say, well, look, we don't torture, we don't kill, but do you think they're complicit in maltreatment of prisoners and of killing people?
Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. They've been complicit. They're very eager to do the bidding of their counterparts in America, and there have been a number of cases where compensation has been given to British subjects who were indeed kidnapped and indeed tortured. And we're not just talking about the odd stress position here. which is bad enough and is torture anyway. There was one case of Binyam Mohammed who was taken to Morocco, and he had his genitals repeatedly slashed with a razor during the interrogation over a period of weeks, and the British spies were involved. So there is no doubt that they are as much involved in this sort of practice as are their American counterparts.
I mean, these are abuses, and the Commons Committee that oversees, or the Joint Parliamentary Committee that oversees intelligence services, says that recently it's had gained more powers, it's gained more ability to get people in and, as you say, grill them when we had the heads of the security services, where they appeared before the committee itself. But you don't think that any of that is substantive change?
I don't think it's full effective oversight yet. The Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament is not a parliamentary committee. It's answerable only to the Prime Minister, who appoints them. It's been around since the 1994 Intelligence Services Act, and until this year, the only things they could look at were policy, finance and administration. Now, Malcolm Rifkind, who's the chair of the committee, has been making very loud noises about the fact we've got new powers, we can go in and investigate operational issues and things like that, which is all well and good. However, if the people on the committee, including Malcolm Rifkind, are not prepared to ask the difficult questions and they don't know where to look, and we can't trust them to make public their findings and the reforms that they're going to try and recommend or impose on the agencies, there will be no meaningful reform. So it's very much a fig leaf for the spies. It always has been. The spies resent any sort of oversight whatsoever, but it's not effective and it's not fit for purpose to this day.
It doesn't sound like the democratic system is in charge of the spy agencies. It sounds like the spy agencies can ignore any sort of oversight at all.
Historically, they always have. I mean, for the first 80 years, they could lie at will. They didn't officially exist, so parliamentarians couldn't ask any questions whatsoever. Since 89, theoretically, they should be answerable democratically to the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary. But they can say what they want to these people. They never give them the full story. And in fact, that was one of the things we whistle blew on, about the fact they lied to government to cover up their mistakes. And I think they are still doing that. So, for example, recently we had the scandal with GCHQ mainlining fibre optic cables coming into Europe on behalf of the NSA, which, by the way, pays them $100 million or so, over the last few years. So they've become the prostitutes of the NSA. And our Foreign Secretary, who's supposed to be their boss, immediately stands up and says, oh, no, I know all about this and I signed off on all this and it's all perfectly legal, only for further revelations to come out and demonstrate that actually he didn't know what they were up to. It's not legal, and the laws which are put in place to oversee GCHQ are 20th century, whereas GCHQ is now dealing with 21st century tech.
I think some people were quite surprised by the importance of GCHQ when these revelations by Snowden came out. It was always this sort of slightly unseen agency out of MI5, MI6. Are you surprised by what's come out about GCHQ and the level of their activities and the scope of it?
Not particularly. Obviously I had greater awareness of what they could do in the past anyway. And I had no doubt that with this sort of explosion of new technological capabilities, they would be racing to catch up along with the NSA. And of course, much more was known about the NSA building this sort of supercomputer city in Utah, and the fact that they can hoover up pretty much whatever they want anywhere. So I wasn't really surprised. I suppose what did surprise me was the fact that the politicians don't seem to have learned from all the previous spy scandals. They still think they know everything they need to know. They still think that 20th century laws are fit for purpose. They are not. And the very fact that we are all we have all our privacy, all our internet communications, all our everything can be hoovered up and stored for use at a later date if the laws change, is very worrying, because laws can change, goalposts can be moved. Someone who is waving a placard as a demonstrator on a street or for Occupy or something like that today might be doing their democratic duty. In 5 years' time, they may be deemed to be a domestic extremist or terrorist group. And if all the information from their earlier activism is stored, they can then be scooped up later. But the other key overriding thing is that to have a functioning democracy, to have any sort of functioning society whatsoever, you need the basic right to privacy. And you need that because you need the freedom to be able to read, to write, to watch, to speak, to plan, to associate, to have freedom of conscience. And if everything you write, everything you say over these electronic communications is potentially being stored, hoovered up and stored, then you start to self-censor and you no longer have a free society. And these are very hard-won rights that the West has fought for over 500 years. And now, just because the technological capability is there, they will use it and abuse it. Now, there is one very good thing that's helping to push back is concerned citizens who are also technically very aware organise things globally now in cities called crypto parties, where if you don't really know that much about how your laptop works, you can take it along. There'll be a bunch of concerned geeks there who will offer their services for free to help you and put open source, pretty good privacy encryption on your computer. They can encrypt your hard disk. They can teach you all the basics of how to retain your privacy, because we can no longer trust our governments to do that for us. We have to take it into our own hands. And in fact, there is a big crypto festival tomorrow in London, at Goldsmith, starting at 11 a.m. I'll be speaking there. And I believe there's also another big crypto party on Sunday, the 1st of December, in Brighton. So anyone who's got any concerns about wanting to keep their communications private, then I would recommend they go along and say hi to the geeks.
People who are advocates for the security services will say, look, well, we need to have this level of intrusion because we're fighting very determined terrorists and organised crime, and there needs to be some level of surveillance. There needs to be some funding for these security services, and they need to be able to operate under the shadows. Isn't there a need for us to be protected from, say, terrorists or organised crime?
Of course there is a need. It's getting the proportionality right within a democracy, and they've stepped way beyond that line at the moment. They are there to protect our national security and our economic well-being. That is written into their mission statements. But they never define what national security is. And they quite often conflate it with a national interest or industrial interest or whatever. So the national security protection should involve trying to counter any threats that pose a threat to our existence as a country. You know, the existential level threat, like the Second World War. Sure, you need to be able to protect the country. But even, I would suggest, at the height of the provisional IRA bombing campaigns in the 70s through to the 90s, that was not an existential threat to the fabric of our nation. And in fact, we were much more under threat then than we are now from this nebula concept of Al-Qaeda within our shores. And yet we didn't give away all our privacies and all our freedoms. There was still a certain sense from the 80s onwards of this proportionality. If someone is seen to be a terrorist suspect, you gathered evidence, you could target them and pick up their information and their communications, but you didn't do this dragnet surveillance of everybody, the whole society. So it's that proportionality that is lacking. And I think they do need to think long and hard, what are the real threats to our country? How can we best police those threats and protect our citizens? And how do we do it in a way which is compatible with democracy?
Do you think politicians, in some extent, have failed to control them? If there was this idea of rationality in the 80s and 90s when we did face the IRA, and now the technology has bounded ahead, and the politicians are playing catch-up very slowly, it seems to me.
They always do, don't they? I don't think most of them even begin to understand the implications of technology and the possibilities, which is why they keep rolling out proprietary software and things like that. I mean, only last week it was announced that they're moving all their private communications, the MP's private communications, to Microsoft foreign-based cloud service, which of course is going to be wide open to all these abuses. So they will lose all their privacy. They don't understand these issues, sure. That has always been a problem, and I think they need to play catch-up, but also legally play catch-up as well. One other point on that, of course, is that in the past, the spies, MI5, kept information on all the politicians. So that's a very a serious problem in a democracy. It's a sort of tail wagging the dog. If they know that there might be information held on them and they're supposed to be the boss of MI5 or MI6, then they're going to be very wary about trying to challenge their power.
I mean, you had evidence of that when you were in the service yourself. Do you think that's still going on?
They say it's not. But how does anyone know? That is the problem. And if they're intercepting all our communications already, they will be de facto intercepting all of their communications. How can a computer tell the difference? So there will be information there. And of course, if you've got guilty little secrets rattling around in your head, like an expensive scandal or a mistress or a lover or whatever, then they might be worried about trying to challenge these spies. And someone might just drop a word in their ears saying, well, you know, by the way, we know about this. Are you sure you want to take these guys on?
What also emerged, I think, from the Snowden revelations was quite how intermeshed the Americans and the British Secret Services were. Do you think that's a significant problem?
It's a huge problem. They've been doing it for decades under what used to be called the Echelon issue, the Echelon operation, which now seems to be called the Five Eyes operation. And it, of course, it's a problem because it circumvents the democratic laws of oversight in each country. And that also happens with Canada, Australia and New Zealand as well. So in the UK, notionally, they have to get a warrant, which is signed by a minister in order to bug our phones. Obviously, tech has outpaced that anyway. And the same in the US. But of course, if they then spy on each other's citizens, they don't need warrants, and then they can just hand the information over. There is an incredibly close working relationship, there has been since the Second World War, between the US and the UK. And the UK likes it because it gives them a seat at the top table still. It's actually that intelligence relationship that allows them to punch above their weight internationally, much more than any other aspect of the relationship, the special relationship with the US, because of course they could put bases across the planet from colonies and things from the breakup of their empire, which then the US likes to use, and they value that very much. And from the Snowden disclosures particularly, we've seen that The NSA is funding partly GCHQ's work to a large amount, and GCHQ bosses, it now appears from disclosures, are very anxious to do the bidding of their new masters, which is, I think, how they should see the NSA. So they're prostituting the agency to focus on the interests of the NSA, which is rampaging its amok around the world, rather than focusing on what could be the more important work of protecting our national security, whatever that is. It's yet to be defined.
We've had all these revelations and various scandals. What steps do you think we can take as citizens or the politicians can take to try and rein back our security services, if that's necessary, and make it into something that we think is actually safeguarding our own interests?
Well, as I mentioned, as individual citizens, certainly just learning a bit more about tech security and how to ensure your privacy by going to things like crypto parties, learning about using open source software rather than proprietary closed source American-made software like Microsoft and Apple, which has built-in backdoors. All these things are very basic steps, and we can all do that in order to protect our own lives, our own privacy. In terms of what politicians can do, it is more difficult. It would be good if they started listening to some expert testimony on this rather than just going with what the spy chief said, because of course they would say that they're doing everything by the law, wouldn't they? So, for example, in the European Parliament, there's been a series of hearings, the LIBE Committee, over the last few weeks, talking to experts from the technological field, whistleblowers, intelligence, security, whatever, trying to get a better feel for actually what are the possibilities. And I was there with a number of other American whistleblowers as well from the intelligence world, giving statements about what the legal frameworks could and should be in a democracy, what it's like on the inside, how they can lie to parliamentarians and not be held to account. And it's all that sort of evidence. Now, it would be lovely. And this is going on in Germany as well. It's going on in the US. It's going on in France. It's gone on at the EU Parliament. It would be lovely if the UK government and Parliament could start asking those sort of questions. But they don't.